Okay, everyone. We are going to be learning how to paint with watercolor for this demo. What you will need are the brushes provided by the school and any of your own brushes that you might like. The synthetic hairs that are really smooth are the best brushes because they are the smoothest in terms of holding paint and distributing paint. Couple notes on brushes. They're delicate. Do not jab or stab your paper. Do not leave them in water for a long period of time. When you're cleaning them, you want to kind of squeeze the water out of them like this. Okay, you don't want to hit the bottoms of them really rough and jab them into whatever your cleaning solution you're using. To rinse watercolor, all you need is warm water. You'll also need a paper towel, a glass of water, a pencil, eraser, and your watercolor set. This is the set the school provided for you. You can mix your colors right on this palette here. So let's talk a little bit about watercolor first. So I'm gonna take the red brush. I'm gonna show you how to activate your watercolor. You can put water on your brush and then gently swirl that water. So doing it right here. Swirl that water into your brush. Then get a little more water. And watercolor is meant to be translucent. Okay? Then there is your color, ready to paint. And I would dab my brush into this. I would add more water or more paint depending on how rich I want that color. But what you don't want is to grab so much paint that it looks like acrylic or tempera paint and becomes opaque. Opaque means you can't see through it. Watercolor is translucent. If you're gonna mix watercolor, clean your brush, activate the next color. You can mix it right on this palette, okay? And if you don't like a color and your palette gets dirty, just take a wet paper towel and absorb the water and the color. Okay, so now we're gonna learn a few techniques. I'm gonna stick with red for now, and I'm gonna show you a flat wash. So what you're gonna do is just mixing some red on my palette, and I'm gonna use a thicker brush for this. I'm gonna get the brush really wet, dab it in here, and I'm going to just put it down, back and forth. Okay, this is just a wash, a flat color. So you can see I'm going over it to smooth out my brush strokes. Okay, so everyone go ahead and practice a flat wash. When I put wet on top of wet, that technique is called wet on wet, and then I'm smoothing it out to that flat wash. And these are terminologies you're gonna wanna get used to. So we're getting used to how we speak about these new materials. Okay, and you can start to see I've made a flat wash here. Now imagine I wanted to go from light to dark here. So now we always with watercolor you can start dark to light, or you can build on top of light to dark. And so I'm going to put a little bit more here. I'm going to work on top of this. It's pretty dry. It dries quickly, and I'm going to work that wet, thicker, darker watercolor, dab my brush dry a little bit, and then I'm going to pull it, creating my gradient. And I can add more water here and pull it to translucent. In watercolor, you can rework it so that I'm making it even more faded at the ends here just by working some water back into that dried watercolor. If you add water back into watercolor, you can erase with the water and lighten it up. And if I wanted to come get a little bit more red, I can work that in. Always pulling in the same direction, blotting my brush if it becomes too wet or too dark to pull out some of that pigment. So now we've worked a layered wash. We did a flat wash, and then we've created a layered wash using the wet on wet technique. to create this little value scale. Now, if I wanted to, I could change this value scale from red to orange. So let's try that. Let's see what happens. Let's activate our yellow and add some yellow into it. And I'm going to start in the midpoint. And I'm just going to work yellow into it. And this is called a variegated wash. When a wash goes from one color to another, when there's two colors blending together, it's variegated. And I can grab a little bit of red. If your watercolor gets a little too dry, go ahead and add water to it. So I'm working back over, mixing into that middle part to get that orange. And I might come in, get a little more yellow. Every time you see my hand coming over, I'm reaching for my palette, just right in front of me off camera. And then I've got my red, orange, yellow. Okay. Now, some other techniques you're going to want to use perhaps is dry brush. So dry brush is when you have not a very wet brush and you put it into the paint. You kind of really load the brush and you can simply create different types of lines with different amounts of paint. So we activate. So I would play with some line control. And then if you go through with the brush, you can see it thins out. Okay, so go ahead and play with some line control. And when you put, if you see here, when you put that line through that wet, it starts to bleed. And that brings us to another technique, okay, where you start with water on the paper or so wetting the paper, making a little pool. Maybe this time I'll use blue. And then I'm gonna dab my color in here. And I'm getting this really loose, beautiful kind of tie-dye bleeds. Okay, again, this is wet on wet when we're painting wet on wet. This is an extreme wet on wet where we're painting directly into water. And I can move it and pull it. So you can let the watercolor do what it wants. Okay, and I could dab water here, see how it pulls. And so I'm really just experimenting, having fun, seeing what happens with it. Okay. The main things we will be focusing is on line work and shading with washes, layers of washes, blending, and creating these variegated adjustments, but then also playing with texture. Okay, so we're going to keep it really simple. Go ahead and make sure you've tried this out and played around a little bit with the watercolor, getting your brushes. Here's another way to do a value scale, really just pulling the paint, right? So I want you to just spend some time familiarizing yourself, creating a little practice sheet. I'm working on a larger piece of paper. I'd like you to work in your little watercolor notebook that the school gave you. Okay. Ooh, I'm creating almost like a sunset. So take some time in class, maybe about 20, 30 minutes, to just play around with the watercolor. See what you can get it to do. Okay. See how it bleeds and blends. What do you like? What's your comfort level with it? Experiment and explore. Make sure you do have an example of wet on wet. Make sure you do have a variegated value scale, so you're following those first steps. Make sure you have your practice lines. Use different size brushes. For instance, using a larger brush, we'll create larger lines and effects. Right, so go ahead and have some fun with the watercolor just to warm up and get used to it. All right, so I'll let you play and then I will direct your attention to our next demo.